hey, it's Wes. And oh boy, has this one been a long time coming. It is time to review, long-term, the Godox V860 Mark II, also known as the Flashpoint R2 lithium-ion zoom. They need to shorten that. So what is it? Well, the short and the long of it is, it's an on-camera flash. But it's so much more than that. The V860 Mark II was obviously the successor of the original Godox V860, also known as the Ving 860. This is one of the earliest flashes to incorporate a built-in, removable, rechargeable lithium-ion battery. What does that give us? Well, it gives us faster recycle times and higher capacity. So this thing can go all day, depending on what you're doing. Now, I have heard of some people actually depleting this battery in one wedding day, but for the most part, most people I know, most people I've spoken to, including myself, it's pretty much impossible to empty this battery in a 12-hour wedding day, unless you're doing TTL all day in dark situations. Which I don't necessarily recommend. I hardly ever use TTL, if at all. I've been using this for a long time, 2 or 3 years, pretty much since it came out. I used these to replace the Nissan flashes that I was using for Sony. At the time, there weren't a lot of options. I started with Sony flashes. They overheated like crazy. Apparently that's been resolved, but that's long in the past for me at this point. And these things, when compared to the Sonys at the time and the Nissans, were just phenomenal. So I have 3 of them now. And honestly, they don't get used as much as they used to, because now I have the V1, which is more useful in some circumstances, and some 8200s and 8600, you know, things kind of get swollen after a time. But let's get into what makes this flash special. And is it even still worth buying today? This has been out for a long time. Well, let's start with the ratings, and number 1, as you know, is build quality. If we have a look at the build quality of this, at the time, it seemed pretty solid and pretty normal. But honestly, this little tiny Sony multi-interface shoe is getting pretty tired. The latest versions of the Sony flashes themselves, made by Sony, actually incorporates more metal in this shoe finally. This version on the V860 just has these little plastic tabs holding it up. And as you can see on the V1, there is a lot more plastic holding this on. Admittedly, I have never broken a hot shoe on one of these. I've heard of lots of people that have those, so I can't pretend that it doesn't happen. That is a knock against the build quality. But what I have to say is, these things have been tossing around in my bags, getting left at venues, getting thrown and dropped and knocked over for years. And I haven't had a single issue with any of them. Even though it's a little bit plasticky, it's still clearly robust and clearly has held up for me. I have to give this an 8 out of 10 for build quality. There is room for improvement, but it is solid. Number 2 is feature set, and this is where it took the cake when it came out. Again, you have that crazy all-day lithium-ion battery cell, which can give you a 1.5 second recycle time at full power. Now, I don't recommend firing these at full power constantly because they will overheat. If you want to know how fast they overheat, just check out my other video where I overheat one on purpose. But overall, if you're keeping your power levels in a reasonable amount, which you should with any flash, then this thing will just go like crazy all day. If I need more power, I'll pull out an 8200, and I'll try to keep that at 1/4 or 1/8 power, because then that one will go all day. And honestly, for me, the biggest feature set of this is just its compatibility with the enormous Godox lineup. So not only can this be fired by an X1T, X2T, X Pro, X Pro 2 controllers, and some of the more basic controllers, this can actually control other flash units. Now, admittedly, I don't use it for that purpose a lot. Why is that? Well, because I find it a little bit cumbersome. Some people love it, but honestly, I didn't learn to love it until the V1 came out and they simplified the menu system for controlling other flashes from this flash. But even so, when this is mounted on your camera, you can use it to control 3 other groups of flashes, and this independently. That is super useful, so if you want to do on-camera bounce flash and have some other lights to kick it up a notch from the back and the sides, you can do that with this. Or you can just put it off on a light stand somewhere else in the room, which is honestly how these get used most of the time for me these days. Just stick them all around the reception hall or whatever it is that you're doing, even in the studio. Put it in a Godox S or S2 bracket, fire it into an umbrella or straight on through a grid, and hey, you're cooking. Then on the side here, we have a flash sync port, and we have a micro USB port, which can be used to update the firmware. Unfortunately, I think that we are probably at the end of the life cycle of this flash with regards to firmware updates. I'm not saying that you should throw these in the garbage because they're still working great, but Godox seems to be putting most of its weight behind the V1 now, so this is the one that's going to be getting more firmware updates in the future. One feature that this has that the V1 does not have is something pretty basic that flashes have had for years. You have the diffusion panel and a bounce card. Now, if that's what you use a lot, this isn't going to do it for you. But what this does sacrifice for that is the built-in magnetic ring and an LED on the inside that's actually surprisingly bright for such a tiny little thing. One note about the LED though, the light is super warm, which is kind of interesting. In some circumstances that's annoying, but honestly in the circumstances that I mostly use this, which is indoor, most of the light is incandescent to begin with, so you don't really notice that. In a studio setting though, it's kind of odd looking. Now I don't want to say that the V860 is left out in the cold when it comes to this magnetic ring that the V1 has, because for $5 you can pick up this magnetic adapter, slap that onto the V860, and all of a sudden these AKR1 magnetic accessories work on the V860 Mark II. Now, okay, does that mean there's no reason to buy the V1? Well, in my experience, when you use this adapter and these accessories and so forth, let's say you pop this on here, it doesn't give you the most diffused light. The round light on the V1 is extremely well diffused, and so it's really designed for these round accessories. When I fire the V862 into this, even when I'm using the diffusion panel as well, it doesn't really give a perfectly diffused round area of light, whereas when I'm using the V1 to do that, if I slap this round head on it, I can fire this into an umbrella, a huge 7-foot umbrella, and it fills it very evenly for some wonderful effects, as you can see in these pictures. It doesn't get quite as soft with the V860, so this is, make no mistake, just an adapter. It adapts to something, and as we know about adapters, they're not ideal, but boy do they work. But for the price difference between these two things, for $5 you can get that functionality. It doesn't have every feature. There are some features the V1 has and other flashes have that this doesn't have, but this does have a lot. It's a solid 8 out of 10 for feature set. At the time that it came out, it was probably a 10 out of 10, but times have changed a bit. Light quality, well, this is an on-camera flash. It doesn't have the highest color stability. It doesn't even have the highest light output stability. So when you're firing off round after round on this flash, it will vary up and down both in white balance and in output level. Not an enormous amount, but it is noticeable. So here we are, out in the top of a beautiful parking garage. I was about to say in the middle of the night, but it's definitely not the middle of the night.
Yet.
It's winter, so the sun goes down at like 3 p.m.
Indeed.
And this is Julie. She can be
Hi, I'm Julie.
she can be found as Qui-Gon Julie on Instagram. Do you have any words?
I know. I didn't prepare.
Do you like my very professional microphone?
I love it.
It's highly compact and useful. Okay, so we're going to take some pictures out here at night with the V860 Mark II and nothing else. I've got these S-bracket adapters on it so I can put whatever modifiers I want on it. And then we can see what we can do with just little flashes and not gigantic powerful lights. Well, like the one that's currently burning out our retinas up here. So, let's do this.
Yeah, let's do this.
Now for me, mostly shooting in wedding receptions and uncontrolled indoor venues, that's not a huge issue because there is so much else going on in the room that the variation on this light is the least of my concern. Additionally, if you're using this in high-speed sync, which this will do, great feature to have, it is going to struggle quite a bit as it heads up to the higher numbers. But honestly, its light fall off isn't as high as in the AD200. So at 1/8000th of a second in high-speed sync, the AD200 is no longer about 3 times as powerful as one of these. It's actually closer to 2 times as powerful, or a tiny bit less than that. I measured it at about 1.8, 1.9. So when you're doing HSS, this actually gives you a pretty solid bang for the buck. And there's almost no difference to the power system in the V1, even though it has a newer battery. You're not buying a high-end studio strobe when you get this, you're buying a Swiss Army knife. It's a 6 out of 10 for light quality, but you shouldn't be expecting that much more from a light like this. Usability. This one obviously is kind of debatable. As I've said before, I find the menu system a little bit cumbersome in this. Now, it's not as confusing as some flashes that just give you blinking lights and vague responses from beeps and bloops from buttons. There is a full-on menu in this that lets you browse around and see what you're doing. But as I said, the more advanced functions are a little bit harder to get into on this thing. And although I don't often get lost in this light, a lot of new users find it confusing to decide which mode they're in, because you have a little radio antenna here, but that's the mode button, but you actually have to press this button to change the actual modes of the flash between optical slave and radio control, and so then that switches between them. And they simplified it a lot in the V1, but people get lost with this all the time. Just take some practice, you gotta read the manual, learn how to use this flash. But again, it's not the simplest or the easiest. I love the power switch on this. I love that almost all Godox products have a mechanical power switch, because when you're using a mirrorless camera and you're getting live exposure preview, if you can just switch that off, it's an easy way to get your exposure preview back to normal, to see what the ambient light is, and then boom, switch it back on again. That's great. That might seem like a tiny little fiddly thing, but that is huge for me personally. And this maintains a very familiar design to most flashes. No surprises here. So the bounce design of this, people are very familiar with. It's like riding a bike. I hate to say, this little locking mechanism on the foot, it's a little bit tired. It takes a little while to get locked in. Once you do get locked in, it's solid, but Godox has since moved on to the twist lock, which is much faster. Not quite as secure, but it saves you a ton of time through an entire day of switching things around. So usability, I'm gonna give that a 7 out of 10. It's not amazing, but there's no deal breakers here. Value. And this is one place that this flash knocks it out of the park, but also kind of loses a little bit. Let me explain. More recently, the V1 came out, which I keep bringing up because, honestly, I should. It's $260, has been known to go on sale for less. The AD200, kind of a big brother, that's $300, just a little more than this. And so this sounds like a pretty good deal for 180 bucks. Why wouldn't it be a great deal for 180 bucks? Well, Godox also has the TT685, which is pretty much the exact same flash, but it takes AA batteries instead of the lithium-ion battery, which means it only costs $110. That is a lot less than this. So if you're just starting out and you need a cheap but powerful flash, the TT685 is a phenomenal value. It gives you, honestly, the most bang for your buck of pretty much anything else you can get your hands on. But this does compete with other way more expensive flashes. If you look at the first-party flashes that are approximately the same output as this, the Nikon SB5000, $600. Canon 600EX Mark II, 480 bucks, and the Sony f60 RM, 500 bucks. So yeah, those first parties are always a lot more expensive when it comes to flashes especially. And then, of course, there are the Profoto A1 and A1X for $800 and $1,100. But that'll give you faster recycle times and more power output, but also it is a huge beastly flash. So overall though, if you take it all into account, it's not the best value, but it is a solid value, great bang for your buck. It's an 8 out of 10. So that gives us a 37 out of 50. It's a decent score, it's not amazing, but this flash is old now. It's well over 2 years old, and has technically sort of already been replaced by the V1. But for a lot of people, there's really no reason to buy this V1, to spend the extra money just to get a round head that is missing a bounce card. So, do I still recommend this? Absolutely, this is a great flash. Especially if you're just starting out and have that little bit of extra money to spend. This thing won't let you down, except when it decides to numerically overheat. What do I mean by that? Well, you can look it up in the Godox V860 Mark II manual. The overheating of this, or rather, the restricting of the output of this, isn't based on an internal temperature sensor. It's based on counting how many shots at what power output over what period of time, and then it restricts it after that. Now, you can reset it pretty quickly by popping the battery and putting it back in. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that unless it's a pivotal moment that you might be missing, because yes, that can result in absolutely overheating it and melting it down, and you don't want to do that to a product that has a lithium-ion battery. That can be dangerous. But I've had times where this flash is clearly not even warm, and it has slowed down a little bit. That's probably why I have 3 of them, so I can swap them out real fast, real easy. But if you want the fastest recycle times, if you want to never be let down by just punching it out constantly, if you're one of those people that just pushes the TTL way up on these and doesn't think about it, you're probably going to want a first-party flash or one of the ProPhoto A-series flashes. All that being said, it's maybe twice in 2.5 years been an issue for me, because I shoot in manual and I'm well aware of what my flash settings are, and I try not to go over 1/8 power if I'm really firing off a lot of shots. It's just a part of the process of, I don't want to sound condescending, but being a professional photographer, just being aware of the limitations of your gear and trying not to melt it down. Now, you do want to be able to rely on it, and if you know your workflow, you might need to go for something more expensive than this. But for this amount of money, this is a killer flash, and it still holds up today. That's it for the V860 Mark II. Until next time, I'm gonna go take some photos.